weeks ago that we would bring an instructor down from Angelina. Michael and I, this is Michael Smith, he teaches history, and Michael and I are both starting our 23rd year with Angelina College. This is the instructor I told you about that once drove from Nacogdoches for how many years? 3 years to teach our Livingston dual credit history students. That, I told you, that's how much our instructors love teaching LISD dual credit. Michael is an excellent instructor. There are a lot of times I wander the hall and I will just drag up a chair and sit and listen to what he's doing. Those of you who know my daughter Brooke, when she got out of high school and we were reminiscing, she said, you know, I think Mr. Smith was my best teacher at Livingston High School. And I said, Mr. Smith was not your best teacher at Livingston High School because your mother was your teacher at Livingston High School. And so he can't outrank me.
Not with you.
Yeah. So Brooke always said, if you're in Mr. Smith's class and he's talking about the American Revolution and George and Martha Washington, it is as if you are sitting at their dinner table, and he is fascinating. So I'm not going to take up his time. I have been summoned to the mothership in Lufkin, and so I don't get to hear his speech. Y'all can all tell me about it, but you're going to love him. He's awesome.
Well, I'm honored that you would ask me to come speak to you today. One of the hardest things about finding something to talk about is finding something that people know about, or at least think they know about. And because you don't want to speak about something that no one knows about, you get the deer in the headlights look like I get from my students all the time in class. And so I wanted to talk about something that is very familiar to all of you, which is the Alamo. And specifically riddles of the Alamo. Now there's an old saying in Texas, when you have a choice between teaching the truth and teaching the legend, teach the legend. And there's no bigger legend here in Texas than the Alamo. And answers are hard to find sometimes concerning the Alamo. Scholarly conflicts over the Alamo and the events that happened there are at times as bitter as the battle itself in a usually much longer duration. When I was a kid growing up in Houston, we were taught in school that at dawn on the morning of March the 6th, 1836, after a 13-day siege, 6,000 Mexican troops overran the garrison inside the Alamo after a 90-minute battle. In the battle, 187 defenders were killed, although 1,500 Mexican soldiers were lost in the attack. Today, we know now that the only historically correct part of that statement is the date of the attack and the length of the siege. One problem was that so little was written down, at least on the Texan side, about the Alamo. Texans were acutely aware of the Alamo's importance, and yet there was not any real serious study made until 24 years later when Army Captain Reuben M. Potter wrote a small book about the Alamo in 1860. Books today abound on the Alamo, but most do not address many of the less famous but still very important questions concerning the siege. And it's a foolish man to claim that he knows the final answer to everything that happened in the Alamo between February 23rd and March 6th, 1836. The best that we can do is now offer some type of careful conclusions that might throw some light on a few intriguing riddles. And the first thing I want to talk about is probably the story you've all heard, probably the most famous legend about the Alamo, and that is, did Travis really draw a line in the sand? Now, ever since William Zuber told that story in 1873, historians have asked this question: did Travis really draw a line in the dirt with his sword? And ask all those, would they stay with him and give any others the chance to leave? Was Lewis Moses Rose, the only man that preferred to live? climbed the wall the night of March the 3rd, and escaped to Nacogdoches to the Zuber home. There are so many things wrong with that story that few historians took it seriously for years. At best, it was second-hand hearsay. Rose was illiterate, and Zuber's parents, who heard him tell the story, never wrote it down. Worst of all, the story did not fit the known facts. Number one, there was only one man named Rose mentioned in Alamo records, and that was James M. Rose, who was President James Madison's nephew and an unquestioned hero. Number two, Travis had not lost all hope on the afternoon of March 3rd. His letters that day had detailed instructions on what the relief coming to the fort should bring with them when they came. And number three, John W. Smith, who left the Alamo later that night carrying Travis' dispatches, calling for assistance, never mentioned the speech or the line. Neither did any of the known survivors until long after the Zuber story had been published. But in 1939 came a shock, a revelation. R.B. Blake, a county clerk working in the Nacogdoches County Courthouse, uncovered some amazing evidence in the Nacogdoches County Courthouse. It showed convincingly that there was a Lewis Rose in the Alamo during the siege, and that the Board of Land Commissioners, in deciding claims on the behalf of 6 different Alamo victims, accepted his testimony as true. So if we accept Rose was there, did he leave under the dramatic circumstances described by Zuber? Well, apparently, yes, he did. In a statement given by Mrs. Susanna Dickerson, one of the Alamo survivors, to the Texas Adjutant General on September 23, 1876, she declared, on the previous evening before the massacre, Colonel Travis asked the command that if anyone desired to escape now was the time to let it be known and to step out of the ranks. One man stepped out, and to the best of my recollections, his name was Ross, or Rose. The next morning, he was missing. Mrs. Dickerson's statement was given 3 years after Zuber's story, but she never seemed interested in her historic role to make up something. But how could Travis have drawn the line on March 3rd when his letters were so hopeful, and John W. Smith never mentioned it at all? The answer is that it didn't happen on March the 3rd. It happened, as Mrs. Dickerson stated, on the night of March the 5th, the night before the attack. By that time, the situation had completely changed. And it will also fit the known historical narrative that Mexican cannon fire tapered off about sundown. So Rose was there and Rose fled. But did Travis really draw the line? Mrs. Dickerson never mentioned it in her statement in 1876. And a recently uncovered Zuber letter casts further doubt on the story. In a letter dated September 14, 1877, Zuber acknowledged that he made up Travis's speech completely, although he said it was based on information supplied by Rose. In addition, Zuber admitted he had invented one paragraph which did not come from Rose at all. Zuber said, "I found a deficiency in the material of the speech, which from my knowledge of Travis, I thought I could supply. I put in one paragraph which I firmly believe to be characteristic of Travis, and without it, the speech would be incomplete." Now, Zuber never said what that one paragraph was, but since the line was in the center of the whole speech, we can only assume that was it. Later, Zuber said that all he was trying to do was to show that on the afternoon of March 3rd, 1836, Travis explained to the command their real situation and offered every man who might be disposed to accept it as an opportunity to risk the chance of surrender or to escape. Again, no mention of the line. If Zuber was hiding a fabrication, he was also protecting a shining legend. And what harm would it be in that legend that only serves to perpetuate the memory of unquestioned valor and sacrifice? As the matter stands now, there's still plenty of room to speculate. J.K. Beretta of the Southwestern Historical Quarterly wrote, well, is there any proof that Travis didn't draw the line? If there isn't, then let's believe it. Now, Sam Houston, let's talk about Sam Houston quickly. Did Sam Houston order the Alamo to be blown up? Houston later said he did, but his critics always maintained that this is just another example of Houston taking credit where no credit is due to save his political career. However, there is evidence that Houston did try to avert the siege and order the Alamo destroyed and the garrison withdrawn. On January 17, 1836, in his letter to Governor Henry Smith, Houston said, I have ordered the fortifications at Behar to be destroyed, and I'll remove all cannons to Gonzales, blow up the Alamo, and abandon the place. The final action was dependent on the provisional government's approval, but Houston, however, issued orders to James Bowie for the Alamo's destruction. On January the 30th, the provisional government angrily complained that Houston, without their express permission, had ordered the Alamo to be destroyed and the garrison and cannons removed. On March 15th, 2 days after the Alamo survivors reached Gonzales, Houston declared to his aide, Colonel George Washington Hawker, our forces must not be shut up in forts where they can neither be supplied with men or provisions. Who was the last courier from the Alamo? Now, John W. Smith, who I previously mentioned, gets all the glory, and he deserves a great deal of it. It was Smith that carried Travis's last dispatch to the convention in Washington and Brazos, leaving the Alamo on the night of March 3rd. However, another messenger left with a final appeal to Fannin, arriving in Goliad on March the 8th. His arrival was noted in 2 different letters, both dated March 9th, 1836. This courier to Goliad left a couple of days after Smith, when the situation in the Alamo was far worse than when Smith left the fort on March 3rd. The evidence indicates that the last courier was 16-year-old James L. Alamo, who left the Alamo on the night of March the 5th. He left no written account, but through the years he told his story to others, and at least 3 have written down his story, and none doubted his word. He later became Justice of the Peace and Mayor of Indianola, Texas. How was Jim Bowie killed? A wide variety of accounts exist, primarily from Mexican sources. Historians agree that after the Mexicans gained the courtyard inside the Alamo, they went from room to room of the long barracks, which is one of the only 2 buildings remaining in the Alamo today, blasting defenders with captured cannons and finishing the job with their bayonets. Breaking into a room along the south wall, they found Jim Bowie laying on a cot, too ill to rise. By that time, the soldados were beyond pity and they killed him where he lay. There is an account by an unidentified Mexican soldier printed in the newspaper El Mosquito Mexicano on April the 5th, 1836, that states, the proud, wicked, and boastful Santiago Bowie died like a woman, almost hidden under a mattress. Another account printed in the Houston Daily Post by Poland Zaldaga on March 1st, 1882, stated that Bowie was carried from his room by 4 Mexican soldiers, and after speaking so eloquently about the college rights under the Mexican Constitution of 1824, his tongue was cut out, and he was thrown alive on a funeral pile. Now, this story was taken from an account by William Zuber. Historians do not take Zuber's word as historically correct. On March 6, 1892, according to an article in the San Antonio Gazette by Andrea Castan de Villanueva, Colonel Bowie died in my arms only a few minutes before the final attack on the Alamo. I was holding his head in my lap when the soldiers thrust a bayonet into his lifeless head and lifted his body from my lap. William Travis's slave Joe told William Fairfax Gray in 1909 that Bowie fired through the door of his room from his sickbed where he lay. The Mexicans broke into his room and killed him, and I saw his mutilated remains later. How did Jim Bowie die? No one really knows. It is very likely that Bowie was already dead by the time the Mexicans entered his room. We do know that one of the Mexican soldiers stuck a .75 caliber brown vest musket under his chin and blew the top of his head off while he lay there. And by all accounts, that Bowie's blood and brains could still be seen on the wall of his room in the low barracks well into the 1850s. Did William Barrett Travis commit suicide? Now, according to Antonio Perez, one of the first friendly Mexicans to reach Gonzales after the fall of the Alamo, Travis stabbed himself to avoid capture. Sam Houston believed the story, and it was widely circulated throughout Texas. However, later, much more reliable evidence indicates that Travis was killed by enemy gunfire, and this was certainly the opinion of those who were there. Travis' slave Joe, who was standing with him on the North Battery when he was killed, is emphatic on the point. Also, Captain Jose Sanchez Rivero and Colonel Jose Enrique de la Pena, whose books I both have in my office, wrote detailed first-hand accounts from the Mexican side, and they both agree that Travis died fighting. Francisco Ruiz, who identified Travis's body for Santa Ana, only stated that Travis was found along the north wall, shot through the head. The way Travis died is, when the Mexicans approached the fort, he fired a shotgun into the throng of Mexican soldiers, flipped over the wall, and one young man shot him right through the head. Did Davy Crockett surrender? It's just possible, yes, he did. Several contemporary sources suggest that Crockett was one of 6 Americans captured at the end of the battle, only to be executed on Santa Anna's orders. Colonel Jose Enrique de la Pena recorded in his diary, published in September of 1836, that in the Alamo, Santa Anna ordered the murder of a few unfortunates who had survived the catastrophe, and whom General Castrillon presented imploring his mercy. Among those was the famous naturalist David Crockett. Santa Anna's Secretary Ramon Carroll and Captain Fernando Rizia told Dr. Nicholas Labade after the Battle of San Jacinto that one of the prisoners executed after the battle was an old man named Crockett. But Labade had no doubt who they meant. Santa Anna's aide, Colonel Juan Del Monte, wrote in September 1836 that on the morning that the Alamo was captured, between the hours of 5 and 6, General Castrillon, who died at the Battle of San Jacinto, entered the back room of the Alamo, and there he found Crockett and 5 other Americans, who had defended until defense was useless. The brave but unfortunate men were brought before Santa Anna. Colonel Crockett was in the rear at his arms folded. Santa Anna's interpreter knew Colonel Crockett and said, "The one behind is the famous Crockett." When brought into the presence of Santa Anna, Castrillon said to him, "Your Excellency, I deliver up to you 6 brave prisoners of war." Santa Anna replied, "Who has given you orders to take prisoners? I do not want to see these men living. Execute them." As the dictator turned away, each Mexican soldier present turned his face toward the wall, and soldiers from the Guerrero Battalion dispatched the 6 in his presence, within 6 feet of his person. In most early Texan accounts, Crockett was reported to have died, quote, fighting like a tiger. Travis' slave Joe and Mrs. Dickerson also believed that Crockett died in battle, although neither saw him until after he was dead. Now, in some circles, it remains dangerous to even question Crockett's ultimate fate. Several years ago, the Columbia Encyclopedia stated their opinion that Crockett had surrendered. That brought an angry reply from the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, declaring that Texas would need a better authority than a New York publication. In their next edition, the New York editors changed their copy. How many survivors? At least 14 people were in the Alamo that lived through the siege. There were 3 that were Americans: Mrs. Dickerson, her infant daughter Angelina, and Travis's slave Joe. A minimum of 10 Mexican women and children also survived. One member of the garrison almost certainly survived. His name was Prodigo Guerrero, and he talked himself free by claiming he had been a prisoner of the Texans during the siege. Guerrero, when the Mexicans came over the walls, took a rope, tied it with his teeth around his wrist, went into a room, shut the door, and when the Mexicans burst in, he jumped up and said in Spanish, "Brothers, these evil Texans have captured me. Thank you for saving my life." And they said, "Brother." He walked out of the Alamo. Both Juan Almonte and Gregorio Esparza mentioned him. He was also awarded a pension as an Alamo survivor from Behar County in 1878. There is also evidence that one of the defenders, Henry Warnell, lived through the assault, but soon died from his wounds. A sworn statement filed in 1858 declared that Warnell was wounded at the massacre of the Alamo and escaped to Port Lavaca, but died within 3 months. There is also a possibility of two other survivors. On March 29, 1836, a story appeared in the Arkansas Gazette about two men, one of them badly wounded, turning up in Nacogdoches. The Gazette reported that the men said that they were in San Antonio, and that San Antonio had been retaken by the Mexicans, and the garrison had been put to the sword. And if any others had escaped the massacre beside themselves, they were not aware of it. This was also a full week before General Houston's report of the fall of the Alamo. How many Texans were killed at the Alamo? Figures range from 180 to Santa Anna's ridiculous claim of 600. Colonel Juan Almonte counted 250 Texans inside and outside the walls of the Alamo. Francisco Ruiz, alcalde of San Antonio de Behar, in charge of burning the bodies after the battle, listed 183. How many Mexican casualties? Well, 19 different sources give 19 different answers. The numbers range from 65 killed and 233 wounded, which is Colonel Monte's number, to 2,000 killed and 300 wounded. Most Texan sources after the Battle of San Jacinto claimed over 1,000 Mexican dead and wounded at the Alamo. The best estimate today seemed to be about 600 dead and wounded. Dr. Joseph H. Bernard was a Texan physician captured by the Mexicans and sent to San Antonio to tend to their injured soldiers. While he was there, he was told that over 200 were killed in the initial assault on the morning of March the 6th. Another 400 were wounded. Dr. Bernard later said that as many as 250 of these wounded soldiers died of their wounds in the following weeks. According to General Vicente Isola, Santa Anna's second in command, there were 2,400 Mexican soldiers in San Antonio and 1,800 in the actual assault. If 600 soldiers were lost, then a 33% casualty rate was a very stiff price tag. The flag of the Alamo. Now today, if you look up in a dictionary or an encyclopedia, you will see the red, white, and green flag with 1824 in the white. According to most sources, the garrison inside the Alamo flew a modified Mexican flag, but the best evidence indicates this was not the case. In 1860, Captain Reuben Potter declared that the Alamo flag was the regular Mexican tricolor of red, white, and green, but with the date of 1824 substituted for the usual Mexican golden eagle. This is based on no evidence, but on Potter's theory that Texans were fighting for the restoration of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. The Texas Declaration of Independence was passed on March 2nd, 1836, and since the besieged Texans inside the Alamo knew nothing of this event, the theory ran, Potter's theory ran, they all died fighting for a Mexico free of the dictatorship of Santa Anna. Potter's theory was at the time appealing, and the fiction of the 1824 Alamo flag continues to this day. But Potter's theory simply does not fit the facts. Texans had long stopped fighting for the Mexican Constitution of 1824 before the Alamo. William Travis wrote on March 3rd that independence is not declared. I shall lay down my arms, and so will every man under my command. But under the flag of independence, we are ready to peril our lives 100 times a day. Now, such a man as Travis is not likely to be flying any type of Mexican flag 3 days later when the Alamo was overrun. The New Orleans Grays carried an azure blue flag into the Alamo. Juan Seguin's Tejano volunteers also may have carried into the Alamo a Mexican tricolor with 2 gold stars standing for Guajira and Texas as separate states that were seen in Behar as the Mexican army approached the town. We are sure that one Texan flag was captured on the morning of March 6th, and it is that blue flag of the New Orleans Greys. Full details of its capture were covered in 1934 by Dr. Luis Castrillo of the Mexican National Museum of Archaeology. The flag remains in Mexico City today, with Santa Anna's faded victory message still attached to it. But there was another flag in the Alamo, a flag that so incensed Santa Anna that when he wrote back to the Mexican government in Mexico City, he said that the inspection of it, the flag, will show plainly the true intention of the treacherous colonists and of their betters, who came from the ports of the United States to the north. This is the flag that Travis and his 30 volunteers brought with them as they arrived at Behar from Washington and Brazos on February 3rd. It was the 13-striped Star-Spangled Banner of the United States, except in the blue field, it had a single large white star. And this lone star was the symbol of a free and independent Texas. What I've done, this is the flag that was brought into the Alamo that made Santa Anna so happy. Hopefully, one day we will be able to find the flag. I have my doubts, but hope. Folks, thank you for having me come and speak to you. If you have any questions, please, I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them. You have any questions? Yes.
The city of San Antonio at that time, how big was it, or how many people there, and what were they doing during the...
There are only about 3,000 people living in Behar at that time. You see, Texas, if you drew a line, the population of Texas, there was 2 Texas. There was Mexican Texas and Anglo Texas. 90% of Mexican Texas lived in that line from San Antonio to the Rio Grande River. You see, in those days, the Rio Grande River was never the southern border of Texas. It was always the Nueces River, about 130 miles to the north. Anglo Texas, if you draw a line down Nacogdoches, most of the people, the Anglos living in Texas, lived in that area east of Nacogdoches. So there were, for years, the Mexican government tried to get Mexicans to move from Mexico City to come to Texas. Nobody in their right mind would leave Mexico City, one of the most beautiful places on earth, high in the mountains, to come to Texas, especially San Antonio. It's too hot. There's Indians. Huge problem. Anybody else have any questions? Thank you.